Good evening. What was just read for us became a passage that greatly changed the perception and the vision that Holly and I had through a difficult time. What I want to talk to you about tonight are some lessons that we learned from where I have grown to call limbo. Sometimes life doesn't go the way that we plan. Sometimes things don't go how we expect. Sometimes you hurt. Sometimes you hurt really bad. And sometimes you wait. And you wait. It turns out what you're waiting for never comes. And sometimes life seems hopeless. This describes our experience in Arizona last month. And Holly and I, we had only ever seen a picture of a baby boy who was to be ours. We never held him. We never called him by the name that we had chosen. But we expected one day that we would. And in some abstract way, he was ours. He was not our legal son, but he was our concern. He was our heartbeat. He was our tears. When we landed in Arizona that Monday, we learned very quickly things had not gone according to plan. That the mother had not signed the consents for us to adopt. She had not signed anything that would allow us to hold the baby, much less even go and see the baby. And what felt like a living nightmare began. Except it wasn't a living nightmare. It was 8 days. 8 days in Arizona with good people. And in that time, we learned a great deal about who we are, who you are, most importantly, about who our God is. What I hope to share with you tonight are a couple of lessons that we learned from our adoption disruption. And I pray that these lessons will assist you when you go through life's unplanned and uncertain times as well. But before I get into that, I want to take just a moment to say, from the bottom of our hearts, how thankful we are for each and every one of you. And how much we love you. Your calls and your texts, your words of encouragement, and most especially your prayers made a very difficult time in our lives much more bearable. And we will never be able to repay the debt of love that you have given to us. Some things that we learned from our time in Arizona could be summed up by this phrase: be honest. Be honest. There are times when we're going through difficult periods where we need to learn to be honest about things. Be honest with one another. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 25 says, laying aside falsehood, speak truth each one of you with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. In difficult times, it is important for us to speak openly and honestly about the things that we are experiencing. And in those moments, we have this ability. And maybe it is a thought that Satan puts into our mind to try and promote shame or promote fear. But we have this ability to think, I have become a burden. And I don't want to become a burden to somebody else. I don't want someone else to be burdened with my pain. I want somebody else to be burdened with my hardships. And so we hide it. And we keep it reserved. And we silently carry that burden alone. But God has given us the relationships that we have for this very reason. This notion that sometimes gets kicked around, God will never give me or I'll never allow me to face more than I can handle, is completely false. Life in general is more than I can handle. And thus God saw that it was not good for us to be alone. From the very beginning, God saw that we needed someone to walk with us and to assist us as we move down the path in which we have been given. What I learned is I need to stop thinking that I know better than God and let others know what I'm going through. What I learned is I've never been closer to my wife than while we were walking this very difficult path together. Every day, we talked about what we were feeling, about what the other one was going through. We reminded each other of Scripture, and we propped one another up as each one had need. And this stemmed because we were honest with one another. But we also learned through this that we need to be honest with ourselves. Psalms chapter 15, verses 1 and 2 talks about the need for honesty to be deep-seated and rooted within us. In verses 1 and 2, it says, O Lord, who may abide in your tent, who may dwell on your holy hill? He who walks with integrity and works righteousness and speaks truth in his heart. And I think there's an aspect of that where we read that and say, we need to speak truthfully to others. We need to tell the truth when we speak to others, and we do. But we need to be honest with ourselves as well. Are you angry? Are you uncertain? Are you fearful? Do you feel like I just don't know what the next step is? I don't know where to go from here. That is okay. And it's time to speak openly to yourself about that for a moment. I don't have the words to say. I don't know what to do. I'm not strong enough to get us through this. These were realizations that I had in Arizona. I can't do this. We would wake up every single morning and we would repeat the previous day. Talk. Pray that God would hear our prayer, would bring us to our child. Watch the hours pass by, and then go to bed sad. And as we went through that, I was looking for the words. What can I say to make this situation better? What can I do to lead us in the right direction? And finally, in these moments, I realized there are no words that make a situation like this better. It's a bad situation. It remains a bad situation. It may always be a bad situation. But what that meant was the pressure was now off of me to turn things around and to have all the answers and to know what the right decision and direction was. The pressure was on him who only could ever handle that pressure. The only one who could fix this situation is God. That didn't magically take the stress away. That didn't take the pain away. That didn't take the uncertainty away. But what a relief it was when I could finally be honest with myself and say, this is all in God's hands. This is up to Him. And in those moments, it led us to great comfort to think about who it is that's actually leading us. Who is it that's walking with us through this? Who is it that's guiding us along this journey? And so I want to share some things that we learned about our God as we went through this trial. Talking with Holly during and especially after, and asking her and sharing with her, what were you thinking? What was it that helped you? What came to your mind? These were some of our thoughts. Number one is God knows our trials. In Mark 14, verse 36, we read about a specific moment of trial in Jesus' life, as in the garden with men who should be watching but are are busy sleeping, with a friend who should be helping but is busy betraying, Jesus falls before the Father. And in verse 36 prays, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." As I talked with Holly about our experience, she reminded me of something that I knew had happened. But it occurred at a time when I was not with her. Because I had taken, when we had landed on that Monday, I had taken Atticus outside to play in the backyard of the house that we were staying at. And when we came back in to see Holly, I recognized what had been going on. I saw the hurt in her face. And she shared with me these thoughts when we got home. It became evident we may suffer another adoption disruption. And I curled up on the couch and I began to sob. And I cried out to God, begging Him not to have us walk this path again. The last disruption was hard, but I knew it would be harder this time. As I prayed, I began to think about Jesus in the garden. As He prayed to God, "Let this cup pass from me." But then He added, "Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done." That kind of became my mantra. Because if Jesus can surrender to God the Father to the point of death, surely I can do the same thing through this disruption. And here's the thing, Jesus did surrender to God to the point of death. And God allowed that death to occur. And as I mentioned this morning, there was ways to intervene, and Jesus could have called angels to release him, and he could have been rescued from this, and God could have said, "That's enough, I'm not going to allow it to occur." But we are reminded that one of the greatest tragedies of all time, the cross, is experienced for a reason. That reason is you and it is me. And God's love for us, to redeem us, and to embolden us, but also to teach us. Titus chapter 2, verses 11 through 14 speaks about the grace of God that has appeared unto all men, bringing salvation and instructing us in the ways that we are to live, in a godly life. Jesus' trials and His hardship, they teach us the importance of holiness. They teach us the great cost of grace. They vividly teach us the depth and the power of the faithfulness of God. There's a beautiful depiction of submission in the trials of Jesus, but also a powerful reminder that God will not leave us abandoned. Because as Jesus cried out in the garden, "Abba, Father, rescue me from this," God answered that prayer in the grave, raising him back to life. God knows our trials. He knows what real hardship is. That is the God that we lean on in difficult times. God also wants us to see Him for who He is. As Bishop read for us so well in 2 Kings 6, 15 through 17. I remember a taxing thought that kept creeping into my mind repeatedly during this time. I would ask God, what have I done? Why is this happening to me? Have I done something to deserve this? And I knew as I asked that question, one, yes, I had done something. It was incredibly deceptive to have the audacity to stand before God and say, "What have I done?" It was incredibly arrogant to think that I don't deserve such difficulties in life. I would often meet that thought with another, a thought that Holly and I both shared. Maybe we're not experiencing this as a punishment, but instead for some other reason. Maybe this disruption was bound to happen before we ever left, before we ever even got news that we were matched. And God did not intervene. And God, in His providential wisdom, did not guide our paths on a different way because God was preparing us for something. Isaiah 55, verses 8 through 9, tells us that His thoughts and His ways are not our thoughts and our ways. Whereas the heavens are higher than the earth, so are His thoughts and His ways higher than ours. So I began to pray during this time more like the father from Mark chapter 9, whose son is crippled by a demon that has taken possession of him. And he has that moment where he asks Jesus, if you can do anything, will you do something? And Jesus says, if I can. And his response to Jesus, I believe that you can. Please help my unbelief. Became a regular part of the prayer that I lifted up in our time there. God, I believe that you can do something in this situation. I believe that you are still a great and mighty and good God. I believe that there is hope. Please help my unbelief as we struggle along through this. God wants us to see Him. He wants us to have our eyes opened and for Him to be revealed, and His Word is able to do that. We would begin to wake up every morning with a new Bible verse, a new story to reflect on and to share with one another. When God heard and answered the prayers of Hannah as she prayed for a child. When God saw and rescued the unnamed prophet standing at the edge of the Jordan with a sunken axe head. When Jesus healed the woman with the flow of blood who just by proximity and touching the hem of His garment was made whole. We get glimpses of our God, repeatedly seeing that He is a God who hears us. He is a God who sees us. He is a God who has compassion and cares for us. In the midst of our trials, we were reminded that this is who our God is. He wants to be seen, so place your focus on your God. Another thought that must have been spoken between the two of us a dozen times or more in these 8 days. We reminded each other nearly every day when Jeremiah writes in Lamentations that we have so much to be thankful for. Now, when he writes Lamentations, he writes in the midst of a terrible ordeal. Things are not going well in the moment that Jeremiah writes these words. In fact, chapter 3 uses some vivid language to describe the situation. In verse 1, he says that I am a man who has seen affliction. He says later in verse 4, I am a man whose flesh is rotting away. My bones are broken. I am enslaved. I am enchained. It's as if arrows have been shot into my stomach. He says, I am pierced. But I want you to begin reading with me in verse 21. A thought that regularly crossed our lips. This I recall to my mind, and therefore I have hope. The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. As we woke up every morning, we would try to think about the new compassions of the Lord. And what we would reflect on was that every day we were hearing from our children, spending time with their grandparents that they likely would not have got. Making amazing memories that they will always have to hold close. And we were spending time with Atticus, watching him grow in new and unusual ways that we would have very likely missed in the chaos of homeschool with 3 boys. And our relationship, Holly and I, was getting stronger and was getting more real and fulfilled. God was giving us reasons to be thankful. every day in the midst of a greatly painful time. And what we realize is that compassion deserves to be passed along. It became harder and harder to just think about what we were going through and not the others who were suffering, and mourning losses and facing illnesses and making difficult choices at that same moment. Our hearts began to focus less and less on what we were experiencing and more on what God had done and people who needed His love. We were reminded, truly God has done many good things for us, and He does so every day. The last thing that I was reminded of is that our God reigns. He reigns supreme. He is the creator and originator of life, who alone has authority and right to make judgment about when a situation is good and when a situation is bad. He has all power. He has all control. Our God reigns, Isaiah 52:7 tells us. And I, a child who belongs to that God, hurt. Really bad. How do we reconcile that? There's a book by C.S. Lewis called A Grief Observed. It's not so much a book as it is a collection of diary entries that C.S. wrote after the death of his wife, Joy. They had not been married very long, just a couple of years, a handful of years, and she was diagnosed with cancer. Her cancer came, and it went, and it came back. And she was taken. Lewis wrestles with the thought that if God reigns and if He is a good God, why am I suffering? And many who have read this work will comment that this does not include all of the intellectual thoughts that fill up so much of his theological works. It is raw and it is emotional, and one reader describes it as more of a howl of anger and grief. In fact, Lewis never intended to publish this book. He wrote it and he put it away. And when it was found, it was released under a false name. And it wasn't until the very end of his life that it actually became published as one of his works. Maybe that's because Lewis was so open and honest about his thoughts throughout. He asked the question, is God a divine veterinarian or is God a divine vivisector? He's using language that recalls to mind people who make incisions, people who cut. And what he's asking is God holding the scalpel and cutting because He is working to heal and produce good in our lives like a veterinarian might do for an injured animal? Or is God like a vivisector, someone who just cuts something open to see what was in it? Let me just see what this thing's made of. This is the question C.S. struggled with. Is our God a healer or a sadist? And what he concludes is that God is able to use terrible, terrible moments to shape us and to heal us if we will trust in Him. I want to read just a small section from his journal. The terrible thing is that a perfectly good God is in this matter hardly less formidable than a cosmic sadist. The more we believe that God hurts only to heal, the less we can believe that there is any use in begging Him for tenderness. A cruel man might be bribed. He might grow tired of his vile sport, and in a temporary fit of mercy, as an alcoholic may have a fit of sobriety, he may quit. But suppose that what you are up against is a surgeon whose intentions are wholly good. The kinder and the more conscientious he is, the more inexorably he will go on cutting. For if he yielded to your entreaties, if he stopped before the operation was complete, all the pain up to that point would have been useless. What he recognizes is that God knows a lot better than I do. And God sees a lot better than I do. In fact, God's not cutting me open to see what I'm made of at all, because God already knows. In fact, one last section from his book, towards the close, he writes, God has not been trying an experiment on my faith or love in order to find out their quality. He knew it already. It was I who didn't. In this trial, he makes us occupy the dock, the witness box, and the bench all at once. God knew that my temple was a house of cards. And his only way to make me realize that fact was to knock it down. Having experienced the painful reality of 2 disruptions to our adoptions, I can honestly say that we know better now, better than ever, who we are and who the God who led us through those terrible moments, who he is. We understand what it means to hope. We've tasted the edges of hopelessness. And there was one final thought that Holly and I both shared, but it's her words that I will leave you with. She said, I knew what I was going through was incredibly hard, but I have faith, family, friends, and prayer to get me through. It hit me how invaluable that is, and how others who don't have any of those things are suffering even worse. Without Christ, it's impossible to face challenges with hope, and that is true suffering. So in hard times as Christians, when we can face them with hope and joy because of our faith, as we go through hard times and we lean on him more fully each time, trusting in him like Christ did, our faith is tested and is either found lacking or is strengthened. And the only thing I will add to that is amen. Brethren and friends, let me ask today, do you have Christ in your life? The reality is that each and every one of us is going to face hard times. And I pray that they are nowhere near, and I pray that they come and they go as quickly as possible. But each of us will experience difficulties. We can be assured of that. But you can also be assured that through Christ we can overcome. In John chapter 16, verse 33, Jesus said that we can have peace in him because he has overcome the world. So I ask you tonight, if you are outside of Christ, if you have not shared in a relationship with him that is built upon faithfulness to his word and submission to him as king, coming before him in your sin and allowing him to wash you clean in the waters of baptism, how will you endure your hardships? Will you stand alone in those moments? Will you stand alone eternally at the return of Christ? You do not have to. We have a God who loves us and desires nothing more than to walk with us through this life, leading us to him, where we can forever be in a place of joy, free of sorrow, free of pain. If we can assist you in coming to know him tonight, please come forward and let us know.